Hello everyone and welcome to the Gunpla Network. I'm the Spicer and today's review of the 2014 high-grade Cosmic Era Aile Strike Gundam comes to you courtesy of those fine folks over at Canadian Gundam. Canadian Gundam is your one-stop shop for all things Gunpla and Playmo here in North America. With a vast catalog that's restocked regularly, a private warehouse option, and flat rate shipping to the US and Canada, they've got you covered. When you're checking out that vast catalog and placing your next order, don't forget to use the promo code Gunpla Network to save 10% off. Overall, I'm actually very pleased with the high-grade Cosmic Era Aile Strike. I think there is quite a bit of simplicity in this kit that ends up being very effective and very beautiful. It's kind of like the Leo before it and kind of like the Infinite Justice after it. I will say I was concerned about the red stickers when I opened the box, but they actually work very well on the wings. There are 4 stickers, one for top and bottom of each wing. They do fold over the front a little bit and the tip of the wing, but generally speaking, they fit pretty well. There's a little bit of gapping, and that could just be me being terrible at sticker fitting, but overall, I haven't had any issues with them peeling up. That could change with time, though, so if you're a little skeptical of stickers, you may still want to paint this section, but there's a nice groove that you can just put some masking tape over, and it will work pretty well. Now, in terms of the visuals of just the base Strike Gundam, it is, as I said, it's very simple, it's very accurate, and it's pretty damn good looking. I have to say, not only is the color separation on this pretty impressive, with it almost all being in plastic except for the eyes and the white strip on the top of the shield on the red part, but it just looks sculpted very well. And this is something I'll mention later on with the Real Grade Freedom. This looks not only screen accurate, but very dynamic and sharp looking, just in and of itself. This is, I think, why the Strike is still talked about, even kind of not maybe over the Freedom, but this is, I think, why this is important and why this got an entry grade versus something like the Freedom. Of course, it is kind of a basic suit, and it's an RX-78-2 clone in a way, but it just looks good, and if you sculpt it right, it just hits different. It's something that 144 has not done well, at least in the Freedom, that it just nails here, and it just looks really, really good. Now, if we take a look at the top half, you'll kind of see what I mean. The head is done very well. It's proportional to the body. It's sharp. It's angular. You get very cool-looking V-fin here that's unique to the Strike. It's got that kind of weird bend in it. It just looks really solid. One thing I would, of course, kind of big nitpick here and a big ask, it would have been nice to have the Vulcans, maybe a different color that points through, but that is more kind of like a real grade, master grade thing that I'm not expecting out of a high grade, and I'll probably go back and paint later, but I think that would add a little bit of extra pop to the head. The chest, as I said, all plastic, so you get the frame portion showing through. The blue, the red work really well, the white, the little blue jewel down on the front skirt, it just all works very well together. Once again, it's very simple, but it's very effective. The shoulders do kind of the same thing. You have the white portions that go around the kind of gray inner frame, and they just work. They're proportional to the rest of the body. They don't stick out too much. They're not too big. They're not too small. They're just there, and they look proportional to the rest of the body. And there's a lot to be said for just nailing that portion and not getting too fancy. Now, if we move to the lower portion of the kit to the legs, still pretty solid. I will say there's a little bit more seam lining here, mostly on the back of the leg. You kind of get a little on the front too. But overall, it is still very aesthetically pleasing. It's simple. It's executed very well, though. There is quite a bit of space between the ankle and the ankle armor. The ankle armor feels maybe a little too small, maybe a little stylized, but that honestly doesn't bother me. It's just something I thought I would point out in case you're really hitting on those proportions. That's the one thing I think might be a little out of proportion on this kit. But otherwise, it is quite well done, and I enjoy it quite a bit. Now, onto the Aile Strike Pack. In and of itself, once again, very simple, but very, very expertly executed. You do have some articulation in the wings and on the thrusters. The thrusters, oddly enough, not on a ball joint, but on a peg that has a little bit of a swivel in there. So you do have a little in and out articulation, as well as the ability to go up and down pretty much all the way, especially if the strike is not attached. I will say the one thing I have not really issues with, but an odd thing to mention, the little black piece that connects into the back of the strike, for whatever reason, sticks in there super hard. So when you pull this off, that piece is going to stick in the back of the strike, at least for mine, and you're going to have to pull it out separately. And one time it pulled the back of the strike off entirely. So kind of keep that in mind. I'm not sure why that connection's so tight, but I'm glad it is. It, I think, helps a lot with the weight distribution that I'll talk about in a moment. But overall, the Aile Strike backpack looks good. It's almost all done in plastic, save for the red stickers on the wings, but everything else, the red, the yellow, the black, the white, all of it, even the little red vents in the front, those are plastic, and that's mind-blowing. Kind of wish we'd have got red plastic for the wings, but, you know, I'm satisfied with what we've got here, especially for its price point not being too crazy for a high grade. Now, once we get it all put together, it is exactly as you'd expect. It's pretty screen accurate. I don't feel the wings are too undersized or too oversized or too long. They feel very proportional to the backpack and everything else. I will say, having had the real grade strike, or real grade Aile Strike, and the Robot Damashi Aile Strike, this is probably the best looking one in terms of proportions and sculpt. The head, the backpack, the legs, everything works here. The thrusters don't feel too big or too large, but they are big enough that they give an extra sense of depth and space to the strike. So it doesn't feel like it's just a basic mobile suit. It feels pretty big on your shelf, and it will have some presence. Now, of course, it is your traditional Gundam colors, so it may blend in a little bit, depending on what you've got it next to, but it is still a very solid looking mobile suit overall. Now, once you get it up on a stand, as I assume most people will want to, because it is a flight pack unit, you can use some effect parts to really sell the ability to take off. And I will say, and I'm probably going to mention this multiple times throughout this posing section here, this was actually a joy to pose. Like, the only time I got flustered or frustrated with posing anything, it was whatever I was posing against the strike. The strike itself, nothing was falling off, nothing was popping apart. It was all very solid, other than, you know, taking the backpack off and part of it being left there, and that was fairly minor. That's the only thing. The shield works fine, the hands work fine, the beam rifle, the beam sabers, the knives, everything is really, really solid on this kit. So if you want to pose it up in the air like this, you should have no issues pulling off a pose. And with it being the strike, being kind of the iconic suit for at least the first half of SEED, there are a lot of poses that you can recreate, and as long as you have the other counterparts, the Duel, the Aegis, Jins, you have a lot of options in terms of posing for a fairly simple kit. Now let me show you what I kind of mean when I say that. If we take a look here, the Duel Robot Damashi figure is a little bit more stylized and quite a bit thinner, but it still feels pretty in place with the high-grade Cosmic Era Aile Strike. You can do some really cool poses, and we'll see a couple of them with the Duel, but this one's reenacting the kick, which I think is like in the first few episodes of SEED, or maybe like the first 10, and it works. The legs are pretty long, the lower calf portion's quite a bit longer as well, and then the feet being a little bit longer add that extra kind of exaggerated animation look to a kick, and I think they knew that. They were going for that, because that is maybe not the iconic SEED thing, but it does match up, and it's one of like maybe the first few poses you think of when you think of the Aile Strike. Now, of course, proportionally, it's going to be a little different than the Robot Damashi Duel Gundam here, but it is okay enough. And we'll see with the Aegis that the Robot Damashi line liked to mess around with scale a little bit. But if you did want to, say, maybe take a little bit more of a effect-based pose, you could do that with the beam sabers. There is a scene very early on before the Assault Shroud where Kira like stabs half of the side of the Duel, and you can kind of recreate that. Now, of course, you don't have any tilted wrists, kind of like the Barbados did, to sell this effect a little more. But I'm pretty sure if you stole one of those wrists, you probably wouldn't, like, your posing wouldn't be ruined by it. It'd be a very minor thing and it'd add a lot of effect. And there's a couple of other kits that do that as well. So you have some options there, but at least with the 2 hands you get in the kit, you can still pull off some nice beam saber wielding poses anyway. Now, of course, with this close-up, you can see the kind of size difference between the Robot Damashi duel here. But let's take a look at something else that's a little different in the Robot Damashi line. That being the Aegis. Kira's ultimate rival in Atherin and the Aegis. And you have a much bigger mobile suit here. And I think in scale, or in lore, it's technically bigger anyway. But it doesn't feel too out of place. The gun does feel a little big, but if you want to pose them next to each other, you can. The old Aegis high grade, I think there's one, you probably do this with as well. Probably wouldn't look as good, and the strike would maybe stand out a little bit more. But hopefully we'll get a high grade Cosmic Era Aegis so that you can set it up with the strike and have all kinds of fun with it. And I mean, there's a lot of posing options here as well. With the strike being kind of simple, you're left up to a lot of other things for posing, but you generally know what pose you're putting the strike in, whether it's a beam rifle, a beam saber, a kick, a punch, the shield, the armor Schneider knives. You have options, but it's not necessarily like the Infinite Justice where you have like 8 different beam weapons you can use, right? It's pretty straightforward. It's pretty standard Gundam. You know kind of what you're going to pose it with. You just need to know what you're posing it against or how you're going to put it on your shelf so that it's not obstructed or obstructing something else. Now, if you have some of the old high-grade SEED stuff kicking around, you can see it here with the Seagyu, which, once again, actually fits pretty well. I think, actually, detail-wise, a lot of the older SEED high-grades work pretty well. The Seagyu and the Jin being 2 very good examples. And while I would love an updated version of these are serviceable for now. I would actually say that posing the strike here on its feet was much easier than trying to get the Seagyu up on the stand, because I was using a little holder piece that I think was a little too big, so one leg wanted to keep popping off. But as you can see here, you can bring the shield around front. It works pretty well, and it is on a peg there, so if you do want to have it more vertical, you can do that as well. Pretty solid. Backpack's not weighing it down too much. Even on a mirrored surface, you have some pretty good footing, so if you have some detolf shelves, you're not too concerned about posing this on the ground. But like I said, with a flight pack unit, I think a lot of people are putting this up in the air. Now, if you want to get a little bit more basic, you can use the Armor Schneider knives and recreate that scene from episode 1 or 2, where Kira recodes the strike on the fly and uses the Armor Schneider to stab Miguel's Jin in like the neck, chest area, and the Armor Schneider knives work fine. Now, they don't fold up and they don't store on the body, but I actually prefer that. The real grade did that, and it made the knives a floppy mess, and it almost kind of ruined the side skirts as well, because they'd like to pop open, and then the knives would just fall out. These are just separate pieces. They're solid, they don't fold, they don't store on the body, but just throw them in like a Ziploc baggie or in the box to store with the rest of the accessories you're not using. And if you want to throw them with, say, the entry grade, or you just kind of occasionally want to take a picture like this, you can absolutely do so, and they are very serviceable. Maybe not the most flashy thing in the world, but they are a little unique in the world of Gundam, at least in terms of weapons and posing. Now, if we want to compare the high-grade Cosmic Era Strike, I thought it would be fairly applicable to compare it to the real grade Build Strike. Now, of course, the real grade Aile Strike would make a little more sense here, but I don't have one anymore. I kind of used it for parts, and I think I broke it at one point anyway. But these actually don't work terribly. They work pretty good. They don't look terrible next to each other, is what I was trying to say. Of course, any of the real grades are going to be notably much more detailed, but if you have these on the shelf next to each other, it's not like the real grade really invalidates the existence of the high grade. They look good next to each other, and I think there's still a lot to be said for the sculpt and simplicity of this high grade. As I said, I did have the real grade Aile Strike at one point, and I still prefer the sculpt of this high grade over that. And of course, the stability. Early real grade Syndrome was real back then, and as much as the build strike isn't terrible to build, I'm still pretty okay with not having an Aile Strike on my shelf that is a real grade. Now, some contemporaries, if you will. The high grade Cosmic Era Freedom in the clear color version and the real grade Freedom. And this proves kind of the point I was talking about with a sculpt and why it's important. Maybe it's the strike simplicity, but this really nails the proportion and the sculpt in a way that the Freedom doesn't in either of the high grade or the real grade. This is something I think works a lot better in master grade out of the Freedom and the Strike Freedom. I haven't built the Strike Freedom in a 1/144 scale yet, but I do have the master grade, and I do have to say there's something about the proportions of those kits that work better in 1/100 than they do here. The real grade Freedom sure has a lot of surface detail, but there's something about it, and I don't know if it's the head's too big, or the gun's too big, or the arms are too small, or the legs are too short, but there's something off with it. And I think, maybe a 2.0 in this would be fine, because there's a lot of issues outside of that in terms of its stability and posability. But, at the end of the day, even if it looks good in terms of surface detail, if it's proportionally weird looking or the sculpt isn't on point, it's still not going to look great. It doesn't look bad, but if you have it next to something like the Strike that really knocks it out of the park in this department, it is more noticeable. Now, if we look at the clear color Strike Freedom, or Strike here, and the high grade Cosmic Airline, you kind of see the same thing. It's a simpler, of course, in terms of its surface detailing, but kind of the same issue. I don't know if it's the head is a little too big, the chest is too small, the legs are too short, but once again, it's just not really doing it. Now, of course, when I build the regular version, maybe I'll change my mind, but I think just visually speaking, in terms of shelf presence in this instance, and it's not necessarily a size thing, but how striking it looks, but legitimately, it is a very striking looking mobile suit in this particular instance. It's sculpted well, it's proportioned well, it's done well in terms of its stability, so you can have it pretty much in any pose you want up on your shelf, whether it's on the ground or in the air, and in any of those poses, you're still going to have that angular look. It doesn't feel too soft, the head doesn't feel too big, the chest doesn't feel too small, the legs work, the arms work, the shield doesn't feel too big, the shield's also not a pain to pose, and the backpack blends together with it. It doesn't stand out too much, it's not too big, it's not too small, and it just overall works. It's hard to really dictate what I'm trying to say, I think, but it is probably, I would say, the best looking version of the Strike in this scale. Sure, the real grade's going to have more detail, but I think this, in terms of its sculpt, proportions, and just simplicity, works much better. So if you're a SEED fan, a Strike fan, or just a really solid high grade builder, or you want to break from something a little more complicated, this is a must have. It's simple, it's easy, it's relaxing, and it looks great out of box. You don't have to put a ton of work into it. And if you want to use the stickers, you're really most of the time not going to notice unless you're really nitpicky about that stuff. But those are my thoughts. If you've built this and have a different opinion, of course, let me know in the comments down below. I'm always looking forward to talking to people about these kits that I've built. But outside of that, friends, I've been the Spicer here for the Gunpla Network. Please stay safe and keep on building. Oh, and I forgot to mention, you get another kit with this.